Hey, I'm Sabrina, and with me today I have Maureen. Thank you for joining us as we talk about some of the events of the Birmingham campaign, how it was covered in different types of news outlets, and what this says about the American Civil Rights Movement. So the Birmingham campaign, which was also called Project C, was a series of boycotts, kneel-ins, sit-ins, marches, and other kinds of peaceful demonstrations that happened in Birmingham, Alabama from about April to May of 1963. So people of all age protested in these events, but the most famous was something called the Children's Crusade, where over 1,000 young students, some as young as 6 or 7, marched peacefully on the city hall. Hundreds were arrested for protesting without a permit, and they were sent to jail for several days on the very school buses that were supposed to take them to class. The police safety commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor, and his crew would viciously attack children and elderly folk with police dogs, fire hoses, and clubs. This scene created a powerful moment that convicted the conscience of many moderate whites. Over 250 news outlets, both black and white, would cover this event. And the president was reportedly sickened by seeing this imagery and thought something would need to be done if it continued. Civil rights leaders knew the value in using media attention to garner sympathy and outrage for their cause. So this is a photo by Charles Moore for Life magazine. This is one of the such photos of high schoolers being hit by a fire hose that really let some of the white people around America who either didn't realize or didn't want to think about what was still going on in their country see the harsh realities of what it was like to be in a city like Birmingham. So Birmingham was selected because it was the largest segregated city in the 1960s. This is also where the Freedom Riders had recently completed their movement. It had an unfortunate history of bombings and violence against African Americans. And since the end of World War II, there had been over 50 bombings of community centers and churches. And while they didn't know for sure what Bull Connor and his police would do, they had a fairly good idea that they would overreact in such a way that would make the white supremacy cause look bad. And as to the time of Project C, it was around Easter, which back then was the second largest shopping season besides Christmas. And they wanted to send a clear economic message to the merchants of the South.
So Martin Luther King was the organizer of the protests, and right before Birmingham, he tried to create a Birmingham-like effect in Albany, Alabama, but it was unsuccessful, and he was arrested on April 13th for violating a court injunction. And while he was in jail, he wrote his letter from Birmingham jail, in which he responded to whites who complained about the disruptions of the protests. And he also delineated his goals for the movement. And in addition, he called out white moderates for contenting themselves with the racial status quo. And he also he wrote his famous quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere."
Yeah, so taking a look at some of the major mainstream press outlets that covered this event, if you look at this list, many of them are still familiar, and I still read some of them today. So by examining a small set of these articles, I found that two of the major themes in the white press were the demonstrators and a focus on the activities of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As by the number of articles, you can see that the publications themselves really focused on him as a central figure. And by looking at the number of editorials and letters, you can see how many of the readers who wrote in were concerned about the demonstrators and the demonstrations itself. So the demonstrators. So there were various perspectives about the actions, composure, and legitimacy of the protesters, and sometimes these different opinions would even be within the same publication. For example, an article in the New York Times properly informs readers about how young the protesters were, how they didn't act violently, and gives fairly good logistics and facts about the event. However, another article for the New York Times by the same journalist that was later published claims that the police did not use dogs and fire hoses, contrary to what more accurate reporting describes. Another instance of this disinformation and inaccurate reporting comes from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The paper claims that African Americans were brandishing guns despite little evidence. And there's a quote from Bull Connor saying, "These Negroes are about as nonviolent as a whirlwind," to further try to discredit the goals and methods of these demonstrators. And in editorials, you start to see some phrases from people saying things such as, "No one really knows who did these horrible things," and that they were extremists on both sides, when in reality the power imbalance was so different between the protesters and authority figures that it's not really fair to compare them in this way. And so aside from the activities and many of the demonstrators themselves, the mainstream press focused a lot on Dr. King's activities during this time. Both the LA Times and the Washington Post would refer to him as a mastermind, which is interesting. On one hand, it acknowledges his intelligence, his ability to strategize and to successfully have a campaign. But on the other hand, it has this connotation of him being kind of like a conniving person or a conspirator, something like that. And so a common theme that appeared was that African Americans didn't want Dr. King to come into their city politics. This point was more emphasized because a lot of the papers might have wanted to minimize the work of activists by diminishing their lawfulness and validity. Another article by the Post sought to explain that not all African Americans and white liberals thought Dr. King made the right decision to launch the campaign so soon after municipal election. In this election, the rabid segregationists had been voted out and a more white moderate had been put in place instead. Whether their intent was to provide a more nuanced and complex version of events or to simply attack Dr. King's reputation is kind of difficult to determine. And so some of the other themes that were found were the use of words that were associated with militancy and military activities. Some of these phrases including integrationists keeping the city under siege, battles going on in the street, people being volatile, and the use of teenagers as an effective weapon. As I mentioned before, blaming outside agitators for what was going on was common. There's a heavy focus on white authority figures, both from the policemen and firemen that were in Birmingham and with these protesters, as well as what the response of President Kennedy was like, or what they thought his response would be like to these events.
Moving on to the Black press. So the Black press was extremely influential because it directly contradicted what was said in the mainstream media. The Black press definitely discussed the demonstrators to a large extent, particularly focusing on the young age of the protesters. And for the second theme, they also discussed the police commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor. The Birmingham protests garnered international attention and repugnance. One of the main reasons for this was the gratuitous violence the police used on the protesters at the behest of the belligerent police commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor. While the white children were sitting in class on May 2nd, Black children took to the streets to protest for basic rights. And then the Black press really championed the young protesters for their bravery, and they wanted to highlight the innocence of the demonstrators. And in doing so, they wanted to humiliate the local government as well as the federal government for letting this happen on children and young children. Most of them were teenagers, but also, as you can see in the photograph, many of them were younger than 8 years old. And many articles brought up how the protesters were taken to jails in school buses, which really exposes the irony of this because school buses were supposed to take the children to transport them to and from school, where they should have been that day, but they had something more important to do. And in one of the papers in the Chicago Defender, they captioned a photograph with the words "the Black Bestie." And so, by likening the historical event in French history in which the powerless French peasantry demolished the Bastille, this prison, this symbol and bastion of absolutist monarchical rule, the paper gives power and importance to the young protesters. Moving on to the second theme, which is the police commissioner, Bull Connor. So Bull Connor was infamous for terrorizing the local population with his heinous suppression tactics to such an extent that it earned him the nickname Bull. And the Black press conveyed his character as being devoid of all humanity. And this is reflected in the papers in which they portrayed him as being animalistic. So in the Atlanta Daily World, after quoting him in an article, they closed the quotes by saying he barked in lieu of saying he said. And in the New York Amsterdam News, they called him a Neanderthal. And then in the Baltimore African American, they only referred to him as Bull, so they forgoed his first name and just called him Bull Connor on every reference, which really put emphasis on his nickname. And then in the Baltimore African American, they went on to explain how he was forced to resign. This was after the protests once Birmingham switched up their governmental system, and Bull Connor was forced to resign. And they said that he had been, quote, dehorned. And then in the same article, they went on to say, quote, "This should serve as a lesson to Bull Connor, but it probably won't. He's been too rabid a segregationalist to learn a new lesson." So by alluding to the old adage, an old dog can't learn new tricks, the article likens Connor to one of his dogs. And by characterizing him as an animal, the Black press reverses the savage narrative, which had been used for all of history to describe non-whites as being savage, barbaric, and to reinforce their position as inferiors. But the rhetoric used in the papers to describe Bull Connor reverses the savage narrative on the very group that perpetuated it, the white establishment. So the themes for the Black press were first the young age of the demonstrators, and then secondly the police commissioner Connor. And then there was also a third one. So when we think of the Birmingham protest, we are reminded of the pictures of these young protesters being attacked by fire hoses and being attacked by dogs. But surprisingly, particularly in the Atlanta Daily World and the Chicago Defender, there was a lack of the photographs. So if we think of this being in conjunction with the young age of the demonstrators, the newspaper editors probably didn't want to include graphic photographs of young people being attacked in order to not deter young people from going out and protesting for what was right. In conclusion, the white establishment felt threatened by the magnitude of protest in Birmingham, and they lashed out in their papers trying to change the narrative, saying that the protesters were violent. And the Black press stood by the facts, which caused international attention, and the Black press was very successful in embarrassing the US on a world stage, which put pressure on the federal government to respond and cemented it as a historical event.